Well, last week we talked briefly about the promotion of radical homosexuality by the society and the government. That was not aimed at homosexuality itself. Homosexual activity is a sin, but it's a personal sin. The active promotion of it through legislation, holidays, and things such as that is a national sin, and that's what that was aimed at. The Bible gives us several other lists of personal sins. We tend to gloss over those or ignore them completely. Gluttony is a good example of that. If you grew up Baptist, then you know that we almost celebrate gluttony on every potluck Sunday. Also, fornication is included in that list. Are you living in sin, or do you endorse or embrace fornication? Idolatry, jealousy, greed, which is idolatry, sorcery, and a few others. They're included in this list, and we don't tend to spend a lot of time on those, although we should. We are going to return to sorcery again in just a moment here. Now, abortion is the same. As a personal sin, you must deal with that in your life. But as a national sin, when the nation passes laws endorsing or even promoting abortion, then the entire nation is held accountable for that. There's a lie going around that Satan doesn't want child sacrifice because children are already lost to him. However, that's a lie because child sacrifice, especially when set up as a national sacrament, will degrade the entire society, leaving it open for demonization. But all the catalogs of sins in the Bible have to do with seduction of the individual away from righteousness. Now, sorcery is very pervasive, yet most people don't see it. You may say, brother, I don't believe in Harry Potter. Besides, what does this have to do with Jezebel or the return of the Nephilim? Well, the word that's translated as witchcraft or sorcery is not talking about hocus pocus TV magic from Walt Disney. It comes from the word pharmakia, and it's from the same word where we get things such as pharmacy and pharmaceutical. Now, this doesn't mean that every medicine falls in this category, but it does mean drugs that alter the mind or the body. Now, this is always involved with ancient sorcery or shamanism, and it opens a portal between the physical and the spiritual world. Now, a portal is simply a tear between the dimensions, and these portals are represented in several places in the Bible as means of moving from the physical or the spiritual, whether the bottomless pit or the portal into the New Jerusalem that we find in the book of Revelation. Now, there are many good books on this subject that are written by those who were into sorcery, but they've converted to Christianity, or some of these books are even by skeptics who wanted to experiment and see what would happen, stuff you really should stay away from. But the books themselves are good and they're informative. But those who were active participants, they will tell you that this always involves the demonic, even though most of them didn't see the spirits as demons at the time. They didn't, they saw them as good spiritual beings. Now that they're out of it, they see that those were demons. Now, not all drug use involves access to the spiritual dimension, but all access to the spiritual dimension involves drug use. It still happens today with shamans, witch doctors, and other occultists such as that. Often, these shamans have so habituated themselves to accessing the spiritual realm that after a while they can access it even without the use of drugs. But they've already been demonized at that point. And these people have the ability to bring the spirit world into the physical world just as Nimrod did. Now, we're going to look at a few examples from the Bible of what sorcery is, including one from the Apocrypha. We're going to start in Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21. It says, now, and this is one of the catalogs of sins that we were talking about, but it says, now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, which is sorcery, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I've also told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Revelation 18:23. And the light of a candle shall shine no more at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived. Exodus 7:11, this is out of Brenton's Septuagint. But Pharaoh called together the wise men of Egypt, and the sorcerers and the charmers also of the Egyptians did likewise with their sorceries. Then also out of the Septuagint, Isaiah 47:9. But now these two things shall come upon thee suddenly in one day: the loss of children and widowhood shall come suddenly upon thee for thy sorcery, for the strength of thine enchantments. And the last one we're going to look at, this is from the Apocrypha, from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 12, verses 3 through 7. This is taken from the New Revised Standard Version translation of the Apocrypha. Those who lived long ago in your holy land, you hated for your detestable practices, for their works of sorcery and unholy rites, their merciless slaughter of children, and their sacrificial feasting on human flesh and blood. These initiates from the midst of a heathen cult, these parents who murder helpless lives, you willed to destroy by the hands of our ancestors, that is precious of all to you might receive a worthy colony of the servants of God. This is like a drug dealer as opposed to a pharmacist, although often today that line is blurred between the two. The goddess worship by whatever name, Astarte, which is the generic name we've been using, Astaroth, Diana, Venus, whatever, always involves sorcery among the priests and priestesses, and the priests that surround her are always castrated males who are transgender. Not only do they try to make themselves look like women, they try to make themselves into women. This goddess is the goddess who can turn men into women and turn women into men. Now, not every follower of the goddess does this, but the priests do, and they did so in whatever land that they were worshiping. If you follow the different societies that practices goddess worship, they're all very similar. Well, today she's returned. She is seducing individuals, she's seducing societies, and she's seducing entire nations. The worship of this goddess requires a castration of the men. This may be literally, but it may not be literally. So how can she deceive vast numbers of men to castrate themselves? Well, you have to think long-term because the demons think long-term. We tend to think short-term because to us, our lifetime is long-term. Demons think in terms of centuries. Beginning back in the 1990s, it was discovered that antidepressants and other drugs were ending up in water supplies and were ending up in aquatic animals after being excreted from human bodies. This was studied further, and in the 2000s and 2010s, more papers were done discussing the problem. I have a link below in the comments section on one of these, or a couple of these. But in some areas, the water was treated and released into the wild where it ended up in animals. But in areas that recycle water, such as Austin, Texas, and Las Vegas, Nevada, they ended up in the drinking water supply. And not just antidepressants, but tranquilizers, antibiotics, antipsychotics, plus other over-the-counter drugs and other prescription medications. Now, this doesn't take into account all the stuff they put in the drinking water to make it what they call safe. It may or may not make it safer. That's a different discussion for a different time. But I do find it interesting that a 12-ounce serving of tap water has more calories than a 12-ounce serving of Diet Coke. Now, these drugs and chemicals, they're excreted through urine or feces, or they're sweated out through the skin, and they end up in the water supply. Many drugs and medications are used as creams, and not all of it is absorbed, and it can wash off. From one of the papers that's linked below, it's calculated that one man's use of a testosterone cream can wind up putting as much of the hormone into the water as the natural excretions of 300 men. All of these things are causing physical changes to aquatic animals, plus it goes into the drinking water and it affects other people. Now, these are environmental problems that we should be concerned about. However, there's more. In another study, also linked below, it has been discovered that tap water is causing spontaneous abortions, what we call miscarriages. Mifepristone, I have a hard time pronouncing that. It's an abortion drug that when used according to direction, a mother, when she takes it, she starts feeling pain. And then she is told to squat over the toilet, over the tub, and to miscarry, and then wash away the evidence. Well, guess what this does? It puts this drug into the water supply. Now, not only does water that is contaminated with things such as arsenic cause miscarriages, the tap water has been contaminated with an actual drug that's intended to cause miscarriages, and it does. As it stands right now, the world is overpopulated. There are those who claim that it's not. I've even heard some proclaim that we're not producing enough babies, but it is. However, the solution is not to kill off the most innocent. It can be debated as to what is best, but what they're doing is killing off the most innocent, which is evil. I mean, it's child sacrifice. I have linked below a video in which I look at the numbers on that, on the overpopulation. We're not going to go into that further right now, but you can look at that video later. Now, not only do we have a population that is more than 8 billion people, but it's still growing. However, it's estimated that we're going to have a disastrous depopulation sometime around the year 2060 or 2065, unless the Lord returns by then. Now, this is not from any forward planning that we might be making, but it's from disastrously low fertility rates. And we see this with women with the tap water, but this has been going on with men since the 1990s. Beginning in the 1990s, scientists started seeing an alarming rate of infertility among men due to plummeting sperm counts. And in studying this situation, the scientists have discovered that it seems that BPAs and phthalates that are in our environment are causing it. These come from plastic. If you put these men in an environment that doesn't have these BPAs and phthalates, then their sperm count returns to normal in a fairly short order. However, once they pass this along to their children's sperm count does not return to normal. It's now encoded biologically into their bodies. These same scientists took notice of a study of frogs in which male frogs in an environment full of these chemicals, the BPAs and phthalates, they would actually take on female characteristics, including laying eggs. Male frogs would lay eggs. Now, whether or not this translates over to mammals or humans, I'm not aware of any study on that, but it is something that's intriguing, and we do have a fertility problem that's coming in the near future. So think about your life. Where you live, would you be able to isolate yourself from BPAs and phthalates? They're in water bottles. They're in canned goods. If you buy canned vegetables, they're there. They're in plastic containers, takeout containers, baby toys, almost anything. If you go outside and walk down the street and look at all the trash, these things are everywhere. Now, they make our lives more convenient. That's true, but they're necessary for living in cities or urban areas, and that's where most people are. You can't, if you live in a city or an urban area, you don't have anywhere to plant a garden or to raise a cow or anything like that. You have to have these things trucked in, and they have to have these chemicals to make the containers that make it possible. The experimental modified RNA jab that Congress declared to be a vaccine, even though it's not a vaccine, has been discovered to have long-lasting negative consequences as well. Now, we all know that it increases the risk of myocarditis, but a Yale study, which is also linked below, has now shown that it actually alters the biology of the body. It's called post-vaccination syndrome, or PVS, and it causes exercise intolerance, fatigue, tinnitus, dizziness, brain fog, variations in the immune cells, the presence of a coronavirus proteins in the blood, and it reactivates Epstein-Barr, among other things. One other thing, we're looking at the drugs that affect the human body here, the sorcery, but one other thing that affects everyone is the use of the birth control pill that was legalized in the early 70s. It was marketed as freeing a woman from any responsibility for her actions. The previous generation had more or less forced women into the workplace, and the birth control meant that an unwanted pregnancy would not derail women's careers. Now, women should receive equal pay for equal work. And there have always been prominent and successful women in trade and in industry. There were even real life Zenas in ancient Rome that were quite popular in the arenas. However, what this did was this removed responsibility and accountability. Instead of saying, wait until you have a ring on your finger, the motto became, if it feels good, do it. There's no consequences now. But also within marriages, a couple might not be able to afford a family, or they can't afford more children than they already have, and this pill made that possible. One side effect of this was not obvious until decades later, and it's the psychological effect on society. The pill works by altering hormone levels. It lowered estrogen levels. Biologically, high estrogen females see high testosterone men. Low estrogen sought low testosterone. It ended up promoting weak men. It also seems to have promoted divorce because when she would go off the pill, her attitude would change toward her husband in many cases, but that study is still ongoing on that. But the pill was intended for a few targeted reasons, such as women going to college, entering the workforce, and things like that. But it caused many negative, unintended consequences. There's a book called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control by Sarah Hill that has more information on this if you're interested in it. As far as I know, she doesn't have any religious viewpoint in this, but she looks at the entire situation from a realistic viewpoint, both the good and the bad. So what does all this have to do with Jezebel and goddess worship? It creates weak people and a weak culture, a culture that wants protection given by the government. They want nurture from the government. They want security from the government. It changes people from their God-given roles of balance, feminine and strong women with masculine and strong men, and it creates a society of domineering women with passive, effeminate men. Now, the historical Jezebel is what we would call fiercely independent. She perfected the art of manipulating, and she used it on her husband, Ahab. Was he effeminate? Probably not, but she was hot. She made him feel good, and she was probably a little bit scary when she got angry, so he did what she wanted. She didn't respect any existing authority because she wanted to be the authority. As the high priestess for the most powerful and the most popular goddess, she especially rejected male authority, and particularly the authority of her husband, who was king. In modern parlance and modern day feminism, she was what we would call an ideal role model for young girls. Her name meant unhusbanded, but also meant daughter of Baal, which is interesting because she was also the consort of Baal. As also, her name is a Hebrew play on words that means island of trash, but the word itself doesn't mean that. It's a play on words that kind of implies that. But Baal, the deceiver, always precedes the goddess. But she is not faithful to him. Although she had a husband, she was head of the household. And it was not a co-equal marriage as marriages should be. Her first allegiance was to Baal. Although she was unfaithful, she always returned to him. Now, Jezebel and Ahab, they converted the altars to Yahweh. They had them torn down and converted to demonic worship. The worship centers were filled with worshipers who worshiped the demons, the false gods, and the goddesses. And I'm sure that just like it was 50 or 60 years ago, it was a social event as much as a religious event to attend services. But the people would always be corrupted no matter why they were there. True believers at the time were persecuted, the schools for the prophets were closed, and faith inside the land of Israel was nearly dead. And we see the exact same demonic activity today. They try to close the churches. They try to monitor what the churches say. They use COVID as an excuse to say, oh, you've got to close your doors. They call what the preachers preach hate speech if you preach the truth, things like that. And they do control the indoctrination, I mean the education of the children. And any preacher who actually teaches the truth is going to be silenced. So if this is your Elijah moment, you have to be prepared for persecution. However, think back to our study on Elijah. Obadiah had hidden many who had not bowed the knee to Baal, so he was not alone. Elijah wasn't alone. He thought he was alone. So when you think that you're alone, and it may truly seem as if you are alone, you have to be strong and stand up. And your mission field may not be some other country. Your mission field may be downtown Chicago. It may be downtown Dallas or whatever. People need to hear the message. What is our world today facing? Astarte, the name that we're using for this goddess, although she goes by many different names, she is the patron goddess of prostitutes. The word for prostitute in Greek is porne, from which we get pornography. Specifically, we all know what prostitution is, but metaphorically, it can refer to idolatry or to an idolatrous community or society. When it's not used specifically, the more broad meaning includes adultery, fornication, and other illicit intercourse. How much of that do we tolerate within the church setting? Do we call the people on their sin? Well, this goddess was popular for a reason, just like in the 70s. If it feels good, do it. She protected and encouraged prostitutes. She was the mother of harlots. And this wording should sound familiar. In the Old Testament, in Hosea chapter 2, verses 4 through 5, he's prophesying, and I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be the children of whoredoms. For their mother hath played the harlot. She that conceived them hath done shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers that give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, mine oil and my drink. Then in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, verse 5, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So the prostitutes all worshipped her and served her. In that culture, the identity of the prostitutes was tied up with the goddess. And that's the way it's going to be again. Or that's the way it is now again. She was their role model. She was obsessed with her sexuality and she was obsessed with promiscuity. It didn't just happen, she sought for it. The culture paraded around her identity as a prostitute. They bragged about it. The entire society admired it. One song to her said, they cannot compete with you, Inanna, same goddess. They could not compete with you, Inanna. As a prostitute, you go down to the tavern, and like a ghost who slips in through the window, you enter there. In other words, she went nightclubbing. Now, this is not talking about the corner tavern where you might go to drink a couple of beers with your buddies. This was the equivalent of modern-day nightclubs. It had a more hedonistic kind of implication to that. Elsewhere was written about her, says, you, my lady, dress like one of no repute in a single garment. A single garment is one that sets somebody apart by what they wear. In other words, it was singular in appearance. You knew what she was because of what she wore. For example, a slave might be given a simple square of cloth with a hole for the head and worn like a poncho. Or a minimalist might wear something very simplistic. For a prostitute, it would be something that would accentuate her wares that she was selling. In modern language, the clothing would be provocative and risque. And although cultures do change over time, today we have come to accept as normal things such as yoga pants, skimpy halter tops, and short shorts for everyday wear. There's no need to wear something bulky and unattractive. There's no need for burqas and clothing that completely hide you, but you could be modest and still wear attractive clothing. Since she was a prostitute goddess, what happens when she returns? She will change the dynamics of the entire culture as she injects the culture with her trade, which is all part of her worship. She's already doing that. Prostitution takes sex outside the bonds of marriage where it belongs, and it places it into the marketplace. No longer is it a matter of morality, it's a matter of trade and commerce. And this cult worship took it from the marriage bed and they put it on display in festivals and parades. The return of Jezebel took sex from the private realm and they put it right smack in the middle of the public realm. What is properly the possession of the husband and wife became the possession of the society at large. Sex was stolen from the realm of marriage and it was given away to the entire culture, and it's everywhere on display. Who do they target? The kids. To paraphrase Adolf Hitler again, he said, "Give me the child when he's 7 and he's mine forever." And never forget that Hitler was not an atheist. He was a pagan who spoke to demons and he worshiped demons. There's a trend in the world today, and it's a trend that's unsurprising since sex is on display in the marketplace, in which young girls want to be seen as sexy. I was reading some articles on the most popular Halloween costumes for young girls, and the most popular ones are scantily clad characters in very adult costumes, such as French maids or even more overtly adult styles. Boys want to be superheroes, firemen, soldiers, and things such as that. And by young girls, I don't even mean 12 or 13-year-olds. The numbers show that it's 7 to 10-year-olds who want these things. When I was that age, girls thought boys had cooties and wanted nothing to do with them. I have a friend whose daughter was in dance, and when she came home with a new costume, he pulled her out of dance because across the seat of the pants, in big bold letters, it said sexy. She is 9 years old. And advertising for these costumes targets young children. It's always the children. The entire culture is sexualized and it's free from any constraints of morality. It's now a commodity that's meant to be bought and sold. For a literal prostitute, it's sold directly for money. Figuratively, it's sold on movie screens, TV, music videos, anywhere that it can generate a transfer of wealth. And these people are considered the idols. Literally, they're movie stars, they're TV stars. Star is another word for the fallen gods who deceive mankind. And these are things that have always existed, but up until recently they were kept hidden away and they're now out in plain sight. They're proclaimed loudly. There's so-called gentlemen clubs, magazines, adult movies. These things are obvious. They don't hide them. They just throw them out there. But there are some of the things that snuck in under the radar over the years were things such as romance novels, which are often pretty pornographic. Popular culture glorified fornication and adultery. Hit TV shows are made about it. And these are not the movies of the past in which somebody erred and they repented and overcame hardships, but today they glamorize filth. And remember, Jezebel is a play on words that means island of filth. Sexuality was almost completely made into something that was impersonal. In the ancient Greek pagan world, Aphrodite was the same goddess as Astarte. She had a son. Do you know what his name was? His name was Eros. The word meant desire. He was the god of sexual desire and love. So Aphrodite has returned and given birth to her son in the modern world. And in the marketplace, we have erotic movies from the word eros, erotic dancers, erotic massages. And today, just like then, it is all imagery. That's how the people are deceived and seduced. She's portrayed in the nude in statues and drawings, and we see this everywhere today in advertising and pop culture, sometimes blatantly, sometimes subtly, and sometimes it's even concealed. Now, you might know to look away from a blatantly pornographic image. You might be immune to subtle imagery, but most people are not immune to subliminal messaging because they're not even aware of it. Unlike some people, I don't think the psychology is inherently evil. It's a tool that can be used positively or it can be misused. A subliminal message or a hidden message is designed in order to pass by the limits of normal perception so that you don't notice it. They may be sounds that the conscious mind doesn't hear, but the subconscious mind does hear, or images that the conscious mind doesn't see. Subliminal messaging is the use of words or images that consumers don't consciously detect, and it may simply be the use of particular colors to evoke an emotional response, or it could be like a hidden image inside of an image. There are examples of they were made public at the time, but there was one ad that had a can of Coke that had ice on the top of it, and the ice on top made the contour of a naked lady. They did a special Pepsi can that when you stacked them up, they spelled sex. I have this example here of Skittles. And you can see the circle part there, exactly what it says. You don't notice that overtly. You see a Skittle and you see the words, but subconsciously you're seeing this. Most of these have made headlines in the past. Sometimes backmasking is used, in which a message is recorded and then inserted backward into a track so that your subconscious picks it up. Now, there's even some evidence that when we speak, our backward voice will reveal the truth of what we say. So if we're lying, it actually tells the truth. The CIA has done a lot of work in this field. It's kind of interesting. But these are people doing it intentionally. They're putting something backwards in there. Your subconscious mind hears it. Now you want to buy whatever it is you're selling. There are subaudible messages in which a message is inserted into a song or a soundtrack at a frequency that you can't consciously hear. There are subvisual messages in which a message flashes so quickly on the screen that we don't see it, but our subconscious mind does. There was a board game called Husker Du back in 1973 that used this manipulative technique, that in their ad that kept flashing "get it" on the screen multiple times, too quickly to be seen. And that was actually the case that prompted the FCC to ban this form of advertising. Subliminal messaging is not sinister, such as the Wendy's logo that was changed in 2013, and you can see down there on our collar that it includes the word mom. But everybody will receive some sort of messaging, and everything that you do, we're already receiving it now. We have been for years. We're inundated with it. But this God is the porn goddess. We saw earlier that porne is where we get the word pornography. But the second part of that word is the Greek word graphe or graphos, which means to write. So pornography literally means prostitute writing. Some of the oldest writing in the world are so-called sacred writings about this goddess. They're vulgar enough that I'm not going to repeat them here, but you can see things that are even more vulgar than that, just walking down the street or turning on your TV. It's no longer hidden in the back alleys. It's everywhere. When the Muslim terrorists flew their planes into the World Trade Center back in 2001, it was to get at the great Satan. And of course, the swamp here in the United States said they were jealous of our freedoms, but it was because we were exporting that filth around the world, and New York City is the gateway to our nation. Now, the terrorists were demonically influenced, but the demons will take a worthy idea, and they will take advantage of that, and they will use it for evil whenever you give in to the demonization. They will never lie when the truth will work for their purposes. But Astarte had reestablished her temple on earth, and it's in the United States. She had to work on the process of converting everything to the way that she needed it to be. She got busy getting her priests and priestesses producing and exporting her product everywhere, and most people were either unaware or they didn't care. Ezekiel 16:49, behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. The United States was a great nation, full of pride. We had plenty of food. We still do. Have an abundance of idleness. And we have now more than ever, since anyone who chooses not to work will be cared for. The people felt no need to be informed about what was going on because they had everything they needed, much less do anything about it. If they didn't know, why would they bother? And if they did know, well, it doesn't affect me. Am I my brother's keeper? Sometimes you are. But the corruption was deep, which is just what the goddess needed. The nation that had been established as a Christian nation was now the porn capital of the world, and we're selling our wares in every nation. We once sent countless missionaries around the world to proclaim the word of God, but we're no longer spreading the gospel, we're spreading filth. Instead of promoting the God of the Bible, we're promoting the goddess of prostitution. The goddess is a seductress. She gets people to abandon rationality. And we see that played out by individuals all the time. However, as a culture, it has only become prominent in the past decade or two that it is just so blatant and out there. It used to be that homosexuals were men who liked men or women who liked women. Today, it's irrational. They can't even define what a woman is, and they don't know which of the 167 genders they are. It's insanity. And it didn't just happen randomly. The seductress worked her sorcery both literally and figuratively. She was considered a goddess who lived in taverns and, as such, was completely associated with intoxicants. But once again, this doesn't mean that it's wrong to have a beer or two with your friends, but we're commanded not to be drunkards. To reread the list of sins in this passage in Galatians 5. Says, now the works of the flesh are manifest. Which are these? Adultery is actually not in the original text, but fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, which is just total depravity, idolatry, witchcraft or sorcery, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I have also told you in the past, that they which do, or those which practice such things, shall not inherit the kingdom of God. The Bible tells us that drunkenness is a sin. Making a habit of it is what this is talking about. Not that you had too much to drink last Friday, but you do it every Friday. That's what it means to practice these things, to do them repeatedly, not just to simply sin, but to actively do them on a continuous basis. A preacher that I grew up with said that he chose not to drink, not because drinking was a sin, but to make sure that he didn't cross over the line into drunkenness. But the goddess is connected with intoxication. And in one story about her, she wanted the powers of civilization that were in the tablets of Enki, so she got him drunk and stole his tablets. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1 says, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. In this passage, the grammar that's used is what's called a metonymy. It's a word or a phrase that can be substituted for another closely related word. For example, in the United States, we can say Washington as a metonymy for the United States government. If we say that rule came from Washington, you know that's the United States government. Or the word sword can be used to represent military power. Well, in this passage, the one who consumes too much wine or barley beer, that's what strong drink is. Liquor was unknown until the 9th century AD. But the person who consumes too much wine or barley beer would become a mocker and a brawler. The goddess strives on these things. She's a seductress and will use many different means to seduce. At the same time, the sexual revolution was taking place. Alcohol consumption skyrocketed. It was always there, but it became much more prevalent. And today we've graduated to opioids, meth, fentanyl, and trank, which is known as a zombie drug. The use of alcohol remained fairly steady from the end of World War II until the late 60s. Then it escalated for about 20 years. It leveled off. Then it escalated again into the 2000s. Also in the 60s, the drug culture became mainstream. A lot of people smoke marijuana, but today's marijuana is not yesterday's marijuana. Today's marijuana has been altered in such a way that it's causing psychoses among users. But psychedelic drugs also became prominent, and these were the gateway to the spirit world. They alter the mind. They alter perceptions. The goddess wants to alter reality and perception. Among individuals, it was an individual sin, but when it took hold of the nation, it became a national problem. Now, along with public sexuality and intoxication, music was always involved. And there's nothing wrong with music. Music is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used or misused. But sensual music, along with sexuality and intoxication, created a very hedonistic environment that permeated an entire nation. Many musicians, as we discussed last week, literally sold their souls for stardom in the music world. And if you don't think that demonic activity would be present in their music, you need to rethink your belief on that. Now, I don't want to rehash what we've already done previously, but think back to the filth that is portrayed so prominently in so much of it. The cult of this goddess sought her power for enchantments in their lives. Her powers were called upon to redirect someone's sexual desires, love potions. The spells could involve simple spells, it could involve rituals, it could involve objects, it could involve fruit, tying knots, or what today is called sympathetic magic, such as fetishes, effigies, voodoo dolls, good luck charms, and a lot of folk medicine. Folk medicine uses a lot of this sympathetic magic. Things like correspondence of colors, like yellow herbs curing jaundice, or red beet juice curing blood ailments, or walnut strengthening the mind because they resemble the shape of a brain. Today in Uganda, it is believed that a barren woman will cause a barren garden, and a man can seek a divorce based solely upon that. So when the goddess's spirit took over one of her prophets, they would get supernatural knowledge. She herself was a medium for the other gods too. Today we know these prophets and mediums, we call them fortune tellers, psychics, other practitioners of the occult. We use nice names for them. If you go down many streets, you're going to see advertising for psychics and tarot readers, and they don't seem to be short on business. If you're old enough to remember, there was Miss Cleo on TV, went mainstream with it on TV, advertised for it. Didn't even try to hide it. Got enough business to stay in business for several years. The goddess brought with her an occult revival. We call it the New Age movement. In one decade, the United States turned from God, turned from gender, and began a sexual revolution, weakened the family, and had an occult revival using mind-altering drugs. Witches quit keeping their witchery a secret. They embrace the attributes of the goddess. And this is not limited to females. Harry Potter increased interest in sorcery and the occult drastically. One witchcraft magazine saw such an explosion of interest that they couldn't print enough copies for the demand. But they took the occult, they combined it with paganism and Eastern mysticism, and we ended up with the New Age movement. And this movement created the New Age Jesus. And you can see some of the things on here that they present. They take the true Jesus and turn him into something that he's not. He was conceived during the celebration of a sex goddess Ishtar and born on Baal's birthday. He promotes peace and opposes division. He promotes unconditional love and acceptance. He calls everyone his children. He uses smooth, politically correct, non-offensive, vague language. He doesn't require repentance, doesn't require holiness or even obedience. He judges no one. He wants you to pursue your own will. He offers ideas and suggestions, not commandments. And he allows most everyone into heaven, and only the worst go to hell. So just like the historical Jezebel, instead of trying to replace the worship of Yahweh, they subverted it. They just moved it subtly a little bit at a time. Building something is hard. Breaking something is easy. It was a revival, but it was the wrong type of revival. It also brought about goddess worship specifically, not just generally. She was called Mother Goddess, Mother Earth, Nature Goddess, the Warrior Goddess, Gaia, Earth Day. Some of the worshipers worship multiple goddesses: Venus, Diana, Inanna, Ishtar, Easter, from which we get the word estrogen, Aphrodite, Astarte, or any of our other names. They would worship them all, but we know that it's one goddess from different perspectives. So we saw two movements during that time: an occult revival and the rise of the feminist movement, the radical feminist movement. Both are related to Astarte. They're separate, but the same. Worship of the goddess brought together the radical feminist movement, the sexual revolution, the rise of intoxicating substances, and an atmosphere that encouraged and pushed all these things on society. This new paganism, which is the old paganism, became known as the new morality. And it adds a new meaning to the song, "Give Me That Old Time Religion," if you think about it. But this began in the 60s, but it didn't end in the 60s. We have progressed today. At least they call it progress. is somehow presented as normal because they teach that there's no more right and wrong. Everything is on a spectrum. Our Christian society has been co-opted and changed into a pagan culture. The United States has been seduced and is intoxicated and possessed by these new gods that are the old gods. It's not just the United States, it's other places as well. But this particular goddess seems to be concentrated here. Ahab's spirit is present also. And just like the historical Ahab, people have tolerated Jezebel until a once Christian nation has been replaced with a pagan vision that is free from the God of the Bible. There's no more God of the Bible. Scripture and tradition have been cast aside in favor of woke ideology. Healthy male leadership has been erased both at home and in the church, and instead they preach diversity, tolerance, victimhood, and many perversions of that which is good. We heard the new Lord's Prayer last week. But these are so-called traditional churches that are teaching these things, and they have drag queen story hour, and the ones that don't have that preach a milquetoast gospel that has no power and very little truth, if any truth. God of the Bible is gone, but the old gods are back, and the goddesses. The Jezebelians control the church in many denominations. Revelation 3:1 says, and unto the angel of the church in Sardis write, these things saith he that hath the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. I know thy works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest and art dead. This phrase, thou hast a name, this is talking about denominationalism. The only legitimate division in the church is by geography. But fallen man has created the necessity for denomination so that you will know what a specific congregation believes, at least to an extent. But that concept has been taken over by the Jezebelians. And the so-called Ahab leaders, they're doing nothing to slow it down, and in many cases, they're facilitating it. It gives them power. And it may not be a physical desire like the literal historical Ahab had for Jezebel, but it's a desire for what she has, and that's power. And sadly, these effeminate pastors seem to be the majority these days. Even if they disagree with what she's saying, these weak Ahab leaders are too cowardly to actually come out and speak against it. They might be called full of hate, or even worse, they might lose their job. In a world of Ahabs, be an Elijah. 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 30 through 33. And when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and tired her head, and looked out at a window. And as Jehu entered in at the gate, she said, had Zimri peace who slew his master? And he lifted up his face to the window and said, who is on my side? Who? And there looked out to him 2 or 3 eunuchs, and he said, throw her down. So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trode her underfoot. It says that she painted her face. That means she put on makeup. She didn't put on makeup just so that she would look nice in her coffin. And when it says that she tired her head, that means she fixed up her hair. She wanted to look nice. Why? It was probably just a vain attempt to use seduction on Jehu and control him just as she had controlled Ahab. And I mean vain in both senses, both prideful and futile. Although she was long past her prime, she was still a seductress, what we would call today a cougar. But Jehu had just arrived from killing Joram, who was the king of Israel and the son of Ahab and Jezebel, and she taunted him. Had Zimri, the murderer of his master, peace? Then in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 23, and of Jezebel also spake the Lord, saying, the dog shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. This is Elijah prophesying about the end of Jezebel. So then again, to rethink it, Jehu had previously denounced her, and she may have remembered the prophecy of Elijah as to how she would die, and she did want to look good for her coffin. It was pride. She knew that her end was coming, and she may have wanted to be remembered for her beauty, what was left of it. And although we're not going to go into the book of Revelation right now, these images are types that will be fulfilled in the book of Revelation. Put them in your mind for when you read the book of Revelation. Unsaved people are always going to follow the demonic spirits, perhaps not with evil intentions, but they have no ability to be righteous. They will always live according to the flesh. God expects us to live righteously. There needs to be a visible distinction between us and the world. We need to honor God by representing his word in a righteous manner. We need to present these ways to others. We need to share the truth. And just as Noah was carried through the sea, we need to be the same. A boat is supposed to pass through the water without letting the water in. Water represents the sea of humanity, the world. And if we let too much of the world into the church, we will all perish. God sends his prophets to warn his people and to purify them through judgment so that we can reflect that light into the darkness. Remember, God may send trials and tribulations not to punish you, but to prepare you for what's coming. Are you prepared? Am I prepared? Are you prepared to be a Jezebel? Are you prepared to be an Ahab? Or are you prepared to be an Elijah? Revelation 22:12, and behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every man according as his work shall be. God has promised great rewards for faithfulness based on works. That's what the rewards are for. Will you be faithful?